So thanks for joining with me. And so for today, I'm going to share with my paper topics that talks about a little bit more focus on the investigations, kind of the things that we talked about for focusing on 360 remote collaborations. And the main thing that we kind of want to share for today is about social presence itself. So as the advancements of the hardware and the software technologies, as you might notice, mixed reality has been severally contributing to a lot of different tasks. One of the main things that we have been seeing and demonstrated so far is the remote collaborations. So for example, it allows the remote expert worker or the person works from the other places to be able to connect into the local user space and start using non-verbal communication cues such as visual for the hand gestures, annotation drawing, or even for the visual pointing to perform like a visual cues kind of the communications to help the local user to be able to understand more further in the enriched kind of the context. But in many of the case, just sharing the information itself is not really sufficient enough. For example, if you have a task that requires the understanding of the contextual environment or maybe needs to understand the spaces of the local user, this might be difficult for the user to do or for the people to set out such kind of the platform. And one of the mainstream things that people has been working on the recent days, which I believe this is not the first time you heard the words, is the 360. The 360 video or the 360 live video is something like a technique that has been used for a lot of different cases. And one of the things that has been demonstrated until now was for the remote collaborations. And why it is so good? Because one of the benefits about 360 video sharing itself is about being able to see independently from the local user, meaning that if you have a 360 video, you could be able to turn around independently, look around away from the local user compared to something like a Skype or FaceTime that you need somebody to kind of hold the camera and change the perspective when you need to see it. And this has been becoming like kind of like a limitation. So having a 360, it does not only provide the ease of being able to walk around with be able to look around independently, it also allows the local user to be more focused on the task without worrying about the perspective of the remote user. And to combine with the mixed reality, a remote user will be able to use those visual cues and on top of that, provide non-verbal communications to help improve the task performance or even the collaborative performance. But when we talk about collaborative performance, it is actually one of the lot of different attributes in come into the place. Like for example, the mental effort itself can be considered as one of the collaborative performance that we use to measure against. And some other things like social presence or maybe spatial presence, these are all the different things. And just like I mentioned, for today's topics, I will be focused more on the social presence itself. So if you know about what is social presence, that is good. But if you're not, there's something like a hidden attribute that has been underlying and is so important for the remote collaborations. Because as I mentioned, when we talk about sharing the space or even try to look at the 360 video, what we want to try to perceive is the presence of try to be socially participating with the local user, or perhaps try to understand how much you can feel immersed into the environment, and which is what 360 is good for. And however, even though that we know from our kind of like coming from our mind, we know that it is good, but they actually need some actual kind of the investigation to help us to prove that whether it is good or not. So that's why I'm trying to come up with a prototype system using a 360 remote collaboration prototype to help us to understand whether if those kind of the platform can help provide or improve the social presence itself and how can it contribute and how can it affect to each of the different visual cues. So in terms of the prototype, we created a prototype system with the local user on the right side sharing the 360 camera wearing on the AR head-mounted display to share the live video to the remote user, and the remote user will be see that in the virtual reality using the head-mounted display. And on top of that, he can use either the visual cues, VR controller, or even the hand tracker mounted on the front of the VR head-mounted display to share the visual cues for them. And once the visual cue has been shared to the local user, and the local user will be able to see through the augmented reality. So as you can see, probably as I mentioned in all of that, it allows the remote user to be able to collaborate synchronously from a distance using the visual cues, and the 360 allows for the view surroundings and also to work collaboratively. And also it does provide the verbal communication just like normal standard video conferencing systems. So in order to provide a study about that, we need to create some things to actually help us to analyze what it is, because social presence itself, even though we give a term for that, it does still have a lot of different side attributes that we need to look at. So that's why we come into a kind of like a complicated few different set of the user study to help us actually understand which one does affect what and how we try to combine them together in different assets to help us measure again whether if some kind of the different visual cue used together could provide different kind of So let's try to look at the first study. So for the first study that we are trying to talk on, we recruited the tasks in the equal role collaboration. So for those who doesn't really know, equal role collaboration meaning that we have both local and remote users try to engage and try to discuss on the work on the task that they doesn't really know about the solutions. So in that case, we try to set a task with the discussion on the puzzle solving task. As you can see on the figure on the right side of the one with the clues with the shader, that's pretty much what we will be showing to the local and the remote user. And there will be a lot of random, like 20 pieces of the random objects being put on the table. And on the right side of the local user, there is an empty bookshelf. So what they need to do, pretty much look at the clue, try to discuss which one's supposed to be go to where, and they will be kind of discussed together using different visual cues based on the conditions. And we recruit the participants in a pair, so they will be doing, one will be as a local role and another one will be the remote role. In terms of our conditions, we measured against having 4 different conditions. First, we have the verbal only, which is our baseline conditions, just verbal communications in the standard 360 without any other visual communication cues. For the others, we have the hand gesture on and off between the pointers, and also the last conditions with all the 4 different clues, the assets being available to the locals and the remote user. And again, as I mentioned, we are trying to measure against the effect of the social presence. So we try to see how much it is affecting them through the different set of the questionnaires after they perform the task and try to ask them to answer for that. So surprisingly, even though that without any visual cues itself, we found that it actually has a high social presence value among all of the different conditions. One thing we postulate that might be because the 360 video itself already give a high level of the immersive and the experience that to the local and remote user, meaning that they thought that even though that without any visual cues, they still feels that they are embodied together, even as in terms of especially we put the 360 camera on top of the local user head. So the remote user, whoever that's connected to the local user, feels that they are looking from the local user perspective. So they thought that they are socially present together, even without any non-verbal communications. And however, when we try to look at participants' preferences, especially after they try all different conditions, they say that pointer or visual pointer is something that is always good to have because it does always provide a simple way for the remote user to point at the things, and it also makes the local user to be able to understand what the remote user is trying to say, because it's just like a pointer, a red pointer, point at the things and you know what it is without even further ado. But having more visual cues like hand gestures is always good because who doesn't really like to have more options, right? So if one doesn't really work on, for example, if the person tries to point at that and says if the person has a blind spot on the pointing or the angle of the pointing, the hand gesture might be able to use it. Or even if you try to do some rotations kind of the things, visual pointer might be some not really doing well in that case, so you might want to use like a hand gesture to do like the rotations kind of things. So in general, as you can see, all of them has a high social presence value, and all of the other things that we're trying to measure against in here also shows like a high kind of the result in a high more than average score, which means that it doesn't really give us any significant result. So we decided to go into a little bit of the different approach and try to look at the study B. And in this case, we no longer try to look at something that is put up individually, but try to put them as a different set of it. So in terms of the study B, we changed the configurations a bit. We have the remote expert collaborations, meaning that we have the person, whoever acting on the remote role will be kind of called as a remote expert, meaning that the person who is a remote expert will have the answer to the solutions, will give the solutions and the task to the local user to pick out the things. So what kind of the task we are trying to do in here is pretty much in a similar room with a random objects being put out on the table, and then we have the empty bookshelf. But this time, whoever plays a remote role will have something in their mind thinking that try to pick out the specific stuff by telling the local user to pick them out and then put it back to the bookshelf. And there is no definite answer for that. That is just up to the remote user to pick whichever they likes. So that's how we try to mock out for the remote expert collaborations role. But this time we also done something a little bit different. Instead of recruiting participants in pair, we try to recruit in the actor and the participants, meaning that one participant at a time and one of us will be the actor, meaning that we'll be playing the opposite role, and once they try that role, they will be swapping to the another role to perform the different tasks. So for the user study, we try only comparing between 2 conditions, which is the verbal and hand gestures against the verbal hand gestures with the other, which is a pointer, and another new thing, drawing. And you might wonder why we are come out like kind of these kind of weird combinations right now. But the main reason is because we try to compare something whether a human like what I can physically do in here. For example, I can talk to you right now, right? And I can use my hand gesture to do the pointing like that. It is all something that human can do even just by the nature of itself. But pointer or drawing, I might need like an extra asset. For example, I need to use a notepad to draw, or even use like other props to help me to point at that. So this is what I'm trying to do and compare against whether if something that human can naturally do can help any improve in terms of improving the social presence, because if they can do something that they can actually do in the virtual world, does it actually help them being feeling more socially present for them? So in terms of the result, we found that there is a slightly lower average score compared to the previous study, which is why we are kind of a little bit shocked to find that, because especially in the previous study, we have no visual cues at all for the conditions. And we thought that it might be because we are using the actor, and that makes the study or the entire process looks a little bit too systematic, so they thought that it's less like a natural conversations. But apart from that, again, a lot of participants prefer having the visual cues, even though they're having more visual pointer and more other different kind of the technique to communicate in non-verbal communication does provide a benefit. But they still like the pointer. General sense, they say that pointer is easiest to use and simplest to understand compared to the other, say, the hands. It is always good to see the hands, but it is not really necessary to use the hands. For the drawing, it is something good, like an alternate approach for the pointer, especially if it's not working, or if they want to do something more like an asynchronous task, which I will be trying to go a little bit more further in the study C in here. So when we start the study A and study B, we found that we might want to kind of sidetrack a little bit for what we are trying to observe in here. So instead of looking more focused on the social presence in here, in this time in the study C, we try to look at more what we call participant preferences. So in this study, we instead having the different conditions, we have one single conditions that we try to recruit participants one by one, similarly having the actor and the participants in the remote expert setup. But this time we give them the answer to the clue, which is you can see in the bottom left side, and then they try to, whoever playing on the remote role will try to look at the clue, try to instruct the local user in one single conditions. And for these things, what we are trying to do a little bit different this time, we have 6 objects they have to move. On all of the 6 objects, 2 of them they have to be using the hand gestures, another 2 they have to use the pointer, and the last 2 they have to use the pointer. And if they are the local role, that means that whoever plays, one of us being an actor, will be using 2 and 2 and 2 for each of the visual cues to communicate and kind of let them to experience about that. And right after that, we ask them to answer the questionnaires to whether decide which one will be good and which one they thought will be useful for perceiving and also giving out the information for. So as you can see, probably the drawing is the winner for today. But even though that it is still doesn't really provide any significant difference or significant result for that. Mainly because we found that something interesting in this condition was hand is always good to have, but it is not mandatory to have, as I mentioned in the earlier study. But having the drawing is something more like additional to the pointer. So meaning that whatever the pointer can do, the drawing can always do, and they are much better. Because for example, imagine that if you try to do the drawing or if you try to do the pointing, you can kind of like point certain things, but it doesn't really leave kind of like a temporary marks on there. So if you want to try to do on certain things like synchronous collaborations, you can use a drawing that kind of draw or highlights on the objects and erase them immediately after that. That is something what the pointer usually do. And in terms of if you want to do like an asynchronous task, a remote user can pretty much try to highlight on the things, like draw on the things. And once they finish drawing, they give the instructions to the local user. And as soon as the local user start working on the task, they can start working on giving the instructions or focus on drawing on the next task, which means that the drawing is always better. I won't say always better, but it is better in the specific cases or certain cases when asynchronous collaborations can be used together with the synchronous collaborations. So to kind of put all of that together, as you see, all of the different visual cues have their own benefits and disadvantage, and it is really hard for us to really know and estimate which one will be good and bad, especially when we try to test on different collaborations role. For example, the equal role, if we have imagine the remote user that is assertive, submissive, and then we have the local user who is aggressive, then this can be somewhat difficult for us to do. And furthermore, we also found that having those equipments at the moment might give limitations in terms of like how many field of view we can see for certain tasks to help us understand different type of the visual cues. So to kind of sum that out together, we have conducted the investigations that try to look at the importance of the social presence and how it can help impacting for the different kind of the role and configurations of for 360 remote collaborations. And in general, different type of the visual cues has their own benefits, and they have something that they are good and bad at. And however, as you can see that we have done like a study A, B, and C, which A and B somewhat connected to each other, but not probably C. So in the future, we might want to look at something more systematic, like how A and B can be connected, and maybe having C. Something that is more like as a C sequential flow that help us to investigate something much more better in details. So that's all for pretty much I will be talking for today, and thanks for joining with me.